Hello, it's me, and I wanted to go through a couple of concepts behind the new puzzles that are out there, which is the tetrahedral series. So there's a couple out there, and I actually thought it was kind of an intriguing series to talk about because it brings into mind some of the puzzle classifications that I've been going through. So let's start off kind of at the beginning. This is what's called the three-layer tetrahedron, which is really just the Jing's pyraminx. And the reason that I like this is because all the Jing's pyraminxes that I had are very rounded. This has a little bit of rounding with it also, but not quite so much, so it kind of gets away with the notion of being a flattened version of a tetrahedron, which is really what I'm looking for as its Platonic version, which is flat, not really rounded. So the question remains, if I'm to categorize twisty puzzles based on what their most basic form is, based on its Platonic shape, then what would I call the triangular version of it? So I've said before that a 3x3 is the most basic shape of the Platonic solid of a hexahedron or a cube, because it's got all the different components to it. So I'm going to define something as the basic shape if it has a couple of properties. First, it has to be a face turner. Now, it doesn't mean that you can have other Platonic solids that are corner turners or edge turners. I'm just thinking in terms of solve strategy and classification. So it's got to be a face turner. As a Platonic solid, it has to have a polygon shape that is the same on all sides. It has to meet at the vertex, meet at the corner with the same angle on all sides. And what's nice about the Rubik's Cube is it almost has a fractile look about it, because every piece inside of it has the look of a square. So it has to be a face turner. It's got to be a Platonic solid, and it has to be the core puzzle that everything is reduced to. So those are the criteria that I have to classify it as a sort of a base twisty puzzle, and that's what I really want for the collection. So as an example, a 4x4 is reduced to a 3x3 and everything above that. What's nice about it is it has this symmetric look, because every piece looks the same. It has that square look to it. Looks great for a collection, and that's how I define it. So when looking at the pyramidal version of it, naturally we would think, well, the pyraminx thing. So the pyraminx would be the tetrahedral version of a face-turning twisty puzzle. So he said, okay, well, does it actually qualify? Well, it's a face turner. Now the thing about a tetrahedron is that to turn this face, it's equivalent to turning this corner. So in a way, it's a corner turner at the same time as a face turner, but that's okay as long as the face turns. What's neat about it is that just like the cube, every piece looks like a triangle. So at the surface, you have a triangle, which is the base shape of the tetrahedron. It comes together at the vertex with the angle the same all the way around. So it has all the same properties and just seems like the right way to go because everything is a triangular shape inside of it. The problem, though, is, well, what about the Jing's pyraminx? How does that enter into the equation there? The problem with the pyraminx is there's actually one other criteria that I forgot to mention. So one is that it has to be a Platonic solid. The second is it has to be a face turner. The third is that it has to be a base puzzle at which all the higher order puzzles are reduced down to. And the final one is every part of the puzzle, every piece, has to participate in the scramble. So in other words, there's no trivial pieces. Every part of this puzzle contributes to it. Edges, corners, centers, it all sort of contributes to that. Nothing is trivial. And the problem that I always had with the pyraminx, as opposed to the Jing's pyraminx as being the base puzzle, but it fits the criteria based upon the fact that it's a face turner and the fact that it's a Platonic solid. But the problem is that when you look at the next higher up, the master pyraminx, you don't reduce this to this. So my thinking is that, okay, this is just a 2x2 version of that this isn't really the base puzzle, this is the base puzzle. And if you don't count the tips, then you have 1, 2, 3. So this is a 3-layer puzzle, just like this is a 3-layer puzzle. So I came to peace with that and said, okay, this is like the pocket version of it. This is like a 2x2, which is kind of like a 3x3 in disguise, so that this would actually be the base puzzle. But the problem with that is the fact that it didn't fulfill one of the criteria. I like the fact that you have little triangles all over it, which is like a fractal version of the larger triangle. But the fact of the matter is, you've got these trivial tips. And as long as you had these trivial tips, and they didn't participate in the scramble, it just didn't seem to fit. What I like about this is that there's no trivial tips. You have corners, you've got edges, and you've got centers. So you've got all the components of your base puzzle, and what's more, the other puzzles reduce down to this, including this puzzle. This puzzle can reduce to Jing's pyraminx. So the question is that, well, maybe this is the base puzzle, and this is the next step up, but you're not reducing this center to this center, they're just still centers. So here's the thing. This is my pitch with this. The Teraminx is actually not a Platonic solid. It's made to look like a Platonic solid, but when it comes to twisty puzzles, now you may look at it and say, well, what do you mean it's a Platonic solid? But I'm defining it specifically in terms of its behavior and its function as a twisty puzzle. Because if this doesn't work, you pull it off. And if you were to pull off every one of these, you wouldn't have a Platonic solid. You would basically have this guy over here, the Teraminx. This is actually an Archimedean solid. So an Archimedean solid is interesting, and we should talk about that when it comes to twisty puzzles, because what an Archimedean solid does is it takes a Platonic solid and does a couple possibilities. It, number one, either truncates it. A truncation is where you take part of your Platonic solid and you sort of slice off in a symmetric way various components. In this case, you slice off the vertexes, you slice off the corners. So that's one way of getting an Archimedean solid. So this is actually an Archimedean solid in disguise and not a Platonic solid. And that's how really it functions. There's other aspects to understand about what you can do to Platonic solids that do enter into twisty puzzling. So what I'm saying is that to be a Platonic solid twisty puzzle, you can't have any trivial pieces. If you do, slice them off and you end up with that version of a Archimedean solid. So is this then the purest version of an Archimedean solid twisty puzzle? And the answer is, well, I think you can look at it like that, because if you're going to say that your solid is a twisty puzzle, then every surface that you do has to turn, basically has to twist, has to be involved within the strategy of scrambling. So you can say that this surface turns and this surface turns. It's kind of a cheat because this surface turn is the same as this surface turn, but it just goes to show that this is really an Archimedean solid made to cleverly look like a Platonic solid when this is the base puzzle. Now, I want to point something else out too before I talk about the solve strategy. So actually, there are other twisty puzzles that fulfill what I would call the criteria of an Archimedean solid, and that's going to be Dayan Gem. So this is basically a truncated tetrahedron. That's really just what it's called, a truncated tetrahedron. And you can look at this as a twisty puzzle, simplest version, a two-layer truncated hexahedron. But if you wanted to get an even better version of that, where you can have each surface moving independently, look at the Dayan Gem 8, I believe. This is another truncated tetrahedron, so it's an Archimedean solid, but in this case, it actually went beyond just sort of the pocket version, and that's really what the Teraminx is. It's a pocket version of an Archimedean solid, of a truncated tetrahedron. This, I would say, is really probably closer to the base puzzle. And that's because what they did is they said, well, if we're going to have that kind of a solid, let's make sure that each side has corners and a center. And some of them even have edges. So this side turns independently, and this side turns independently. So I would say that this is the purest version of a tetrahedral version. This is the purest version of the Archimedean solid of a truncated tetrahedron. So that's what they've achieved with this. And with each side, you've got your own centers, you've got some edges, and you've got corners. This side, you've got centers and just corners, but they all move independently. And what's more, it's a three-layer puzzle. So this would be the truest, purest version, by my definition, of a twisty puzzle version of these solids, in this case an Archimedean solid. So we have to understand that if we're going to think of a universal solve strategy with these puzzles. Okay, so at some point it would be nice if somebody can design the gem version of this, where you take this, and this is an Archimedean solid, this is the next step up. Well, actually, I think we can say that this is the Archimedean solid version of this. This is really the same puzzle. If you pluck these off, you'd end up with a puzzle that looks like this. So really, this is the pocket version of this. It's an Archimedean solid. Well, Both of these are pocket versions. And these are the actual versions. So if we had to think about what we call the master pyraminx, that is really just the Archimedean solid of a truncated tetrahedron. And it all matches. If you pull off this trivial tip, you'd end up with something that looks like this. You've got this part that maps to this piece over here, right? Then you've got these, which are the corners. If you take a look at this, every piece here, or most pieces, generally map up to what you see here. So, splat. Okay, let's look at the green. So basically, here's your center, and you're going to have your edges. So here's here's your edges over here. So here's your center, and here are the edges of this face, which maps to the centers of this face. It's the same thing. So these are the edges over here, and the rest are your corners. Corner, 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 corner. So when you think about it, the Dayan Gem 8 is really just the truncated version of the master pyraminx. And if you really wanted to change the vernacular that makes sense, the master pyraminx is simply a trivially tipped, truncated tetrahedron, and this is the purest version of that. Just like this is the truncated tetrahedral version of this is the truncated tetrahedral version of this. And what I'd like to see is, with the emperor pyraminx and all of that, is to have a gem version of each one of those just to add to the collection, but this is the purest version of that. Now I want you to notice something about this process of truncation. When you truncated this, when you sliced this off, you ended up with a pyramid, right? But you also ended up with another side over here. So when you went all the way around, you went from a 3-sided layer, and when you truncated it, you had a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So now you've got 6 sides over here. So you went from a 3-side, and the truncation caused a 6-sided here and a 3-sided over here. So really what an Archimedean solid is instead of the Platonic solid, where you have one shape on all faces with the angle exactly the same, with an Archimedean solid you have two shapes, two or more shapes sometimes, but basically two shapes that are part of your polyhedron. In this case, triangle on one face, and a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and a hexagon on the other face. So you basically went from 3 sides here to 6 sides. Here you went from a point to 3 sides. So that's why you get this kind of a puzzle over here. Okay, so I wanted to set that to rest. I don't look at what we call pyraminxes as actual Platonic twisty puzzle solids. Yes, this is a Platonic solid. It is by its shape, a triangle. But when it comes to twisty puzzle functionality, where you can't have trivial tips, this has just been a built-up, modified Archimedean solid, specifically the tetrahedron, where this is actually 6-sided. If you look at it and solve it as that, and this is a 3-sided. Okay, so that's truly what that is. Now, what if I truncated it all these sides down to a point where they sort of met in the middle? So imagine this gets truncated down to here. This gets truncated down to here as well, and this gets truncated all the way up. What you would have is a triangle. This goes all the way down, this goes across, this comes up, this comes across. I know I'm kind of covering it, but you'd end up with another triangle. So truncate this down long enough, you'll go from a triangle to a hexahedron, back down to a triangle, and this will also be a triangle. So what shape did I just create by doing an ultimate truncation of taking this all the way down? Well, I'm going to have triangular shapes on all the faces, triangular shapes on what was the edges. So I'm going to have 4 here, 4 here. I'm going to have a shape that gives me 4 triangular, that gives me 8 faces that are all triangles. So what I've just created is an octahedron. So if that's the case, and we can say that a tetrahedron is a truncated derivative of a pyraminx, or of a Jing's pyraminx. So let's look at this base puzzle. If we're going to say that that this is a truncated version of this, if I truncate a tetrahedron, a pyramid, far down enough, I'm going to end up with an octahedron. So you could say that octahedron, with all of its 8 triangular faces, is really a extremely truncated version of a hexahedron. Now, so you can sort of see this will end up with 3, end up as a triangle. So if I keep it going down, I move at this face. Well, I move at this face, and this face. Those are 4 faces, right? corners turn, turn, and turn. And if I do them independently, I'm going to end up with 4 faces I can turn at. 1, 2, 8 rather, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now you may say this turn is the same as this turn, but stick with me for a little bit. So basically, if I truncate it enough, I'll end up with an octahedron. This is not the right representative of it. The right representative would be this guy over here. So this is the diamond's cube. We'll come back to this, but basically, you could say that the diamond's cube is a truncated version of this. But whereas all of these turns, half these turns look different from the other half. If I look at it like this is the center, edge, edge, corner, corner. If I look at here, this is corner, center, center, edge, edge. Really, I've created everything here. So this just has the same kind of turns, but they all look the same. No matter what angle you look at them, they all look the same. And there's 8 of them. Here, the way you look at it, there's no parity with perspective. This is different from this in terms of how you look at it, but this is exactly the same. So what's interesting is that one Platonic solid, when it comes to twisty puzzles, is a derivative of another Platonic solid. I'm not saying so mathematically, I'm saying so from a twisty puzzle standpoint because the solve strategy is the same. So if we're going to say that this is a base twisty puzzle with its centers and that everything else is reduced in conjunction to that, these are all reduced. The 3-layer, the 4-layer, the 5-layer, the 6-layer. Well, actually, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 6-layer. And I got myself a 7-layer over here. They're all reduced to this base puzzle, the Jing's pyraminx. It provides all the criteria. It's a Platonic solid. It's a face turner. It has no trivial pieces, and it's the base by which all puzzles are reduced to. This doesn't fulfill that criteria. This is the pocket version of this guy over here. This is a tetrahedron. This is a truncated tetrahedron. And basically, it is the base puzzle at which all these others are solved. And this is really just an extended version on that. So this is not, from a twisty puzzle standpoint, a Platonic solid. It's a Archimedean solid, and it's a truncated tetrahedron with these little trivial tips glued on top. All right, I hope I've made my point with that, but in terms of solve strategy, if I were to say that this is the base of this, then what I can also say is the next step up, well, this is the next step up. We'll come back to this one. But if I were to say this one, this is this can be truncated and modified to the octahedral version. And that octahedral version is, well, it's not this. Whoop. It's not this. This is the face-turning octahedron, right? It's 3 layers, and this is 3 layers. But there's some important differences here. This has a nice look as an octahedron. It's got all the triangles here. It had all the pleasant aesthetics of these guys. But I would say that this isn't from a twisty puzzle standpoint, purely the modification of this. Now, if I were to truncate this down, I would end up with a puzzle that looks like this. But functionally, it looks different. And the reason is because this has a center here. This does not. This is centerless. This runs into the same problem that the pyraminx ran into. So in reality, when I truncate this down, this wouldn't be the base tetrahedron. It actually would be this guy over here. This would be the base tetrahedron because it has all the same twisty puzzle elements. Now, I'm being a little nitpicky with that because you can solve this with a similar strategy. But what I'm saying is that this would be the next, this would be the true truncated version, although it doesn't have the same style because, you know, these stickers look nice and symmetric, these don't. So it doesn't have that appeal, but it does fit the criteria. Okay, so despite the fact that the stickers don't look as symmetric, and I get that, I agree, and and because of the fact that no pieces are trivial, this is going to be what I'm going to call the baseline twisty puzzle Platonic solid of a tetrahedron. From this, you can truncate this, and this is just this octahedron is really just a truncated version of the tetrahedron. So it's a derivative puzzle, just the way a 4x4 is a derivative puzzle of a 5x5, and a 2x2 is derivative of a 3x3. Okay, so I'm going to make another stretch here. I once asked the question, which of these are the base puzzles of their Platonic solid? And I said this was, because everything is reduced down to this, but you don't reduce this octahedron down to this. So this is derivative of this. The other puzzle is the cube. Now, this cube looks like a nice symmetric puzzle, but I'm going to say also that this is a derivation, a shape mod of this Jing's pyraminx. Because in my mind, this Jing's pyraminx is your base puzzle, of which the others are offshoots. Even all the octahedrons, even though in math they are their own prime Platonic solids, in twisty puzzle world, they're derivatives of the tetrahedron, just in terms of solve strategy. So if this is a derivation, if this is the cube is a derivation of the Jing's pyraminx, then I would also have to say too that the master pyraminx, rather the master's cube, is simply a derivation of this guy over here, the master's cube. Now, why is that important? Well, we can certainly match piece for piece everything that you see here, which we'll get in a little bit. But if I'm going to say that this is a derivation of this, how is that helpful? And the reason is because I might be able to get an easier solve of this if I solve it just like the master tetrahedron. Now, those that have solved the master tetrahedron will probably see that, well, the solve is very similar, you do it the same way anyway. But that's using algorithms that we started off with this. Maybe there's an easier way if I just look at it as a shape mod of a tetrahedron. So the only way that what I'm saying is going to make sense from a classification is if I'm going to make the solves easier or make more sense. Okay. So just to show that, and just for the sake of completeness, and I've done tutorials on how to solve this, but this will sort of be the baseline solve. What if I try to solve this cube as though it were a tetrahedron? That this move could be based on this move or this move. It maps out with both. Okay, now before I go into the actual solves of these and start moving up regarding these other puzzles, I have one more concept to talk about with the Archimedean solids. We talked about the concept of truncation, and from truncating an Archimedean solid, you get another kind of solid with different shapes on different sides, two shapes on different sides. And I hope I set to rest the notion that all of what we call pyraminxes are really just truncated tetrahedrons and not baseline Platonic solids, but Archimedean solids. Not a trivial solve, I mean they're fun puzzles, but they're Archimedean solids. Okay, so there's something else that, there's two other properties of Archimedean solids. You can truncate Platonic solids to get Archimedean solids. By the way, the process that I talked about, where you take a Platonic solid and you truncate it to such a point that the truncation meets in the middle, is called a rectification. So you can look at octahedron as a rectified tetrahedron. So we can actually solve it based on that. There are other ways of getting different kinds of Archimedean solids, and when it comes to twisty puzzles, I might as well very quickly describe that. In addition to truncation, you can also do what's called combination, and that's where you take the basic shapes of one twisty puzzle, of one Platonic solid, and you combine it with the shape of another Platonic solid. For instance, let's say I have a cube and I have a well, I don't know that we can combine these, but a cube and an octahedron. So, well, we'll do these two here, cube and an octahedron. So a cube has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 faces, 6 square faces, and an octahedron has 8 triangular faces. If I took them apart and combined them together, I'd have a shape where it has all of that, all 6 of these and all 8 of these. And there's a puzzle like that, and we call those cuboctahedrons. So a cuboctahedron. So this would be an example of a cube octahedron. Notice you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 square faces, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 triangular faces. So this cuboctahedron is a combination of these two twisty puzzles. Now, at what point do I call this sort of like the purest form of that? Well, I would call it that if all faces turn. Remember, to be the definition of what I would call a base puzzle, a true twisty puzzle version of it, all faces have to turn. The other way to look at this is that this is a truncated cube. So if we take a hexahedron and we truncate it and we slice off these, you can sort of visualize it here. What you're going to have is you're really going to have the cuboctahedron. So in addition to saying that it's a combination of the two, you can also say that a cuboctahedron is a truncated a hexahedron, a truncated cube. And you can see the form of that. Here's your center over here, and these faces, well, the one face would be still square-faced. The other face here is going to be triangular-faced. So you can see that this is Archimedean solid, which is the truncated version of the cube, the cubic Platonic solid. So that's what this is. But the way this works is that just these faces turn. Because just these faces turn, I've really described just a corner turner. So as it's just a corner turner, that's a dino cube. So the rainbow cube is a Archimedean solid that is really just a modification of a dino cube. So the question is, by my definition, what would be an actual pure twisty puzzle equivalent of an Archimedean solid, which is the cuboctahedron, which you can either look at as a truncated cube or as a combination of the octahedron and the cube, the hexahedron. And the answer is the rainbow cube plus. Because what this does is this not only turns on this face, but the other face that was created, which is your original twisty puzzle face, turns on that face as well. So this turns as well as the corners turn. So you created new faces here that turn independently, and you've maintained your face here that also turns. So the rainbow cube plus is a cuboctahedron, but what I would call the purest form of it, and the purest form of the base form of a cuboctahedron. Now, before we were looking at this as a hybrid, and it is really a hybrid, because in order to create that, you'd have to have a face turner combined with a corner turner. A face turner combined with a corner turner and truncated down would be this rainbow plus cube. So in order to get a pure Archimedean solid, that has to come from a hybrid puzzle. Only hybrid puzzles can make what I would call a pure Archimedean solid, because you have new surfaces, new shapes, new faces, and each one of them has to turn. Otherwise, it's just a modification. So that's my twisty puzzle definition of an Archimedean solid, which is every face, including the new face that you made, was created. One other example in the world of twisty puzzles. Let's say you've got yourself your octahedron. So couldn't I just truncate this and truncate this back to a tetrahedron? Couldn't I do that? Actually, I use this one here. And the answer is no, you really can't. Because what's going to happen if I truncate this? If I truncate this, I'm going to be truncating all of these corners. Well, how many sides am I going to end up with? I'm not going to end up with a three-sided I'm not going to end up with a three-sided shape. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. So by truncating this, the new surface is going to be four-sided, and this over here is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this version of Archimedean solid is going to have one face that's going to be four-sided and another face that's going to be six-sided. In other words, we're going to get a new shape called well, we'll just call it a truncated octahedron. And just like this is a truncated tetrahedron, where I get a 3-side and a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 side, if I truncate an octahedron, I won't get a tetrahedron. By truncating the tetrahedron, I ended up with an octahedron if I did a whole rectification of it. But if I do that same kind of a truncation here, one side will be four-sided, the other side will be six-sided, and that's going to be this puzzle right here. So this is another Dayan Gem, and Dayan Gems do a very good job of giving us some really neat Archimedean solids. So you can see this is our four-sided area here as a truncated this, and what we maintained is this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-sided over here, which is made because of the truncation here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so that's what this is. Now, if this were a pure twisty puzzle Archimedean solid, every one of these surfaces would have to twist. Well, this one does, but this one does not. Now, this particular one has a deeper turn, so in some ways you can look at this as a master octahedron, but just with only half of the faces turning. However, I've got this Dayan Gem, and this turns not just at the face over here, but also it turns on the faces over here. So they have given us a pure Archimedean solid twisty puzzle because all the faces, including the new faces, turn. So we have both a truncated tetrahedron where all the faces turn, and a truncated octahedron where all faces turn. And they were kind enough to give us 4 corners over here, and they gave us a center with edges and corners over here as well. So this would be the purest basis version of that. And this is 3 layers over here, so it actually wouldn't be this one. It would be this one. That's what this one would be. 1, 2, 3 layers. Okay, so this is the truncated version of an octahedron. This is the truncated octahedron. Okay, so I wanted to point that out too, because that does help me in terms of my solve strategy and not just looking at the structure. We have to look at the function of the puzzle as well. One final point to bring up, which I'll bring out as well, is I want to solve the mystery of what these are. What exactly are these things? Well, every Platonic solid has what's called a dual. A dual is simply what you do when you take the faces and turn them into vertexes, and you take your vertexes and turn them into faces. So in many ways you're truncating the vertexes, the corners, and you're building out the faces. So if you were to swap those out, and we have 8 corners that become faces, and we have 6 faces that become corners, what you would get is you get the octahedron. So the octahedron is not just a truncation of a rectified truncation of the tetrahedron, it's also the dual of the hexahedron. Because if you look at it over here, every face can become a corner. Actually, it's like this. And every corner becomes a face. So that's like a dual, so to speak. There's more that we can talk about with that, but suffice it to say that the dual of the icosahedron is the dodecahedron. But what's the dual of the tetrahedron? So if this were to be substituted for a corner, a vertex, and this were to be substituted for a face, I still would have 4 faces and 4 corners. So the tetrahedron is its own dual. If I turn this into if I just swap those out and turn faces into corners and corners into faces, I'd end up with a tetrahedron. So what does this have to do with twisty puzzles aside from a very interesting property? Well, what that really means is that if I were to define what kind of an octahedron this is, and what kind of an octahedron this is, although they look the same, this from a twisty puzzle standpoint is the dual of the Rubik's Cube, of the 4x4. And that's because this over here is a corner turning octahedron. The corner turning octahedron simply took the face turning capacity of a Rubik's Cube and turned them into corners. So I would say that the corner turning octahedron is simply the twisty puzzle dual of the cube, of the 3x3. And it's all the same. What you have here is you've got the centers and you've got the corners. So it's an edgeless Rubik's Cube. So this would be the dual of that. So what then is the face turning version of this? Because notice this face turner does not have the center that this does. What I would say is that this is the truncation of the pyraminx. Notice how similar they look? So if I truncate a pyraminx down to a tetraminx, and I keep truncating that down, I'll end up with this puzzle over here. Actually, the truncated version of this would be this. Okay, if I keep truncating this down, I'll end up with this octahedron. All of all sides here. So I would say that this version, the mass-produced version of the octahedron with all these nice face-turning octahedrons, is really the truncated and rectified version of the Teraminx, which is a pyraminx. But the actual truncated, rectified version of the true tetrahedron, which would be this guy, would be this guy over here. Okay, so that's how I classify that. This is the fully truncated version of the Teraminx, which is the actual version of what we call the pyraminx. And this, which was actually designed and not mass-produced, is the actual truncated version of the 5-layer tetrahedron. So the 5-layer tetrahedron is the same puzzle as this in terms of truncation. Okay, so with that said, with that classification out of the way, how is that going to help me solve these things?